I want to share my testimony and the goodness of God and how He brought me through an aortic dissection and valve replacement. On January 10th, 2023, I went to an imaging lab to have a couple of tests done, an EKG and an echocardiogram. I had some symptoms leading up to that, shortness of breath, and I would get real hot, especially at night. But my cardiologist and nurse practitioner set me up to go to have an echo done, which was away from their office. I went at 10:30 and 10:30 a.m. and the nurse told me that they didn't have a spot for me. They asked me to come in at 10:30, but when I got there, they didn't have anyone available to do it. So they asked me to come back at 1:30, which I did. And here's the first move of God. There just happened to be a cardiologist there in that office at that time on that day. Again, it's an imaging center. There's usually not a doctor there. The nurse said something doesn't look quite right. So she asked the cardiologist to take a look at it. And when he did, he said, "Mr. Sweeper, we have to take you immediately to the emergency room." And I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "You have a tear in your aorta." And he showed me the images. And that leaking valve was causing some problems with fluid around my heart. Okay, so I didn't understand really the seriousness of it. So I called my wife, who works at a hospital in surgery, and I could hear it in her voice immediately that something was wrong. So again, I still didn't understand the seriousness. I took the ambulance to the emergency room. She met me there. My son came in, and my sister-in-law came in, and they ran some more tests, and the surgeon came out and explained everything to me. Now, he was already prepped for surgery. They were already getting the OR ready. And he explained to me what was happening. And I still didn't quite understand it. I asked my wife, I said, "What does all this mean?" And she said, "It's open heart." And that's one thing that I had always feared in my life, having open heart surgery. But the surgeon told me, "You have a 50-50 chance." And I really wasn't worried about that because I knew I would be on God's side. Whatever 50% God would be, I would be on His side. My sister-in-law prayed with us. They had trouble getting me to sign the consent. I didn't really want to sign it. I was going to leave and not come back. And I even tried to negotiate with the doctor and said that, well, can I just come back next week? He explained to me that it was so severe that if I left, I probably wouldn't be back. So they rolled me in, rolled me down the hallway to the surgery, to the operating room. And I just audibled out loud, I surrender all. I surrender all. Now, I'll tell you, that comes into play a little bit later. But my wife and son rode with me on the elevator, and the nurse and the stretcher, on the stretcher, and got in the operating room. The last thing I remember was the anesthesiologist looking over me and asking me to count backwards from 3. From my understanding, the surgery went well. The heart part of the surgery went well, but I had pneumonia, which complicated things. So they had to put me on a ventilator. I was on that ventilator for 30 days. My wife and son stayed all night the first night at the hospital. And I had a lot of dreams while I was on that ventilator, and not so good dreams. But there's one dream I remember where I wasn't gasping for breath, but my breath was getting shorter. My niece had come in to visit me that day. And I know my breaths were getting shorter. And somehow I had an awareness. Now I could hear things around me. I could hear people around me at times. My wife asking me to squeeze her finger if I knew her, or if I knew my sister-in-law. I remember her playing some gospel music for me and playing a confessions tape or YouTube message by Creflo Dollar one morning. And I remember my niece moving around the room on another day. And I remember her playing some music for me. But at that time when my breaths were getting shorter, I felt like I was in some kind of line getting ready to enter somewhere. Never saw where it was. But at that moment, I was okay with dying. I was okay. I had sense enough to know that if this was going to be the end, that I would be with God. And I was okay with it, whichever way it went. And I heard some voices, or I heard a voice that said, okay, give it to him. And my niece tells me later that the doctors were trying to come up with some mixture of medicine that would help me, or that would help my breathing. Eventually my breath started getting back, and I could feel that it was back to normal. Eventually, I started beginning to wake up a little later. Again, I went in on January 10th. I woke up on February 12th, which was Super Bowl Sunday. And I still was not conscious of where I was. As I was waking up, I saw a figure that was in the image of my brother who had passed away 6 months earlier. And I kept waiting on him to come through the door. He walked the figure walked by the window, but he never came in. The next person to come in was the nurse. And I told him as I was waking up what I had just seen. And I know he probably looked at me as if I was out of my mind, which I probably was with some of the medication. But I went to the point of waking up on February 12th. My wife was there with me. And I had so many visitors, family and friends, that came in over the next couple of weeks while I was in ICU. After ICU, I went to a step-down room and I stayed there for a week. I couldn't eat or drink. I still had the trach in. And as a matter of fact, when I was in ICU, I was still on partial oxygen. And I remember very vividly them rolling that ventilator out of the room. Remember, I had been on it for 30 days. But after the step-down unit, I went to a rehab facility in which they were very, very good. I went in there on a wheelchair. I couldn't walk. I couldn't do for myself. And it was an humbling experience, a humbling experience when you can't do something for yourself. But eventually I stayed there about 2 weeks. And I remember the ride home, and it felt so good. I went in on January 10th. I came back home on March 10th, 60 days. And it was just an experience. But my message to you is that if there is something in your life, just let Jesus lead you. Give it all to God and be okay with whatever happens. You have to release. You have to truly release and be okay with whatever happens. I'm still in the recovering process, but I'm getting better. And I thank God so much for it. Amen.